beautiful beings. Welcome to Monique Psych. My name is Monique Van Hattem. I'm an independent psychometrist and clinical psychology student at SMU. And today's video, we're going to delve into the different categories of psychology in South Africa. So I did quite a bit of research on this topic, and the various categories of psychology do overlap quite a bit. So what I'm going to do is give you a brief overview of what each category typically does. So every category is important, and each type of psychologist is specifically trained to help people or to develop the field of psychology. So I'm going to try and be as objective and as accurate as possible. If you feel that I've missed something out, or if you disagree or agree with me, please comment below. We are here to develop together. So before we get started, I have a little disclaimer. The definitions throughout this video are straight from the HPCSA website. However, any examples that I may give along the way are my own subjective understanding of what I think each category of psychology is involved in. Okay, so I hope that you really enjoy this video, and I hope by the end of it you will have a better understanding of the various categories of psychology in South Africa. Let's get started. The first category we're going to talk about is clinical psychology. Clinical psychology is a specialist category within professional psychology that provides continuing and comprehensive mental and behavioral health care to individuals and groups across the lifespan. This includes the assessment, diagnosis, evaluation, and treatment of psychological and mental health disorders that range from mild to severe and complex. Psychological assessment and formulations are based on biological, social, and psychological factors. Clinical psychologists deliver a range of high-intensity psychological interventions with demonstrated effectiveness in treating mental disorders and psychological distress associated with medical conditions. According to the scope of practice, clinical psychologists can assess, diagnose, and intervene with clients who are dealing with life challenges, particularly those with developmental and forms of psychological distress and/or psychopathology. They can identify psychopathology in psychiatric disorders and psychological conditions. They can also diagnose psychiatric disorders and psychological conditions. Clinical psychologists apply evidence-based psychological interventions with psychological and psychiatric conditions. What differentiates a clinical psychologist from the other categories of psychology is the severity of psychopathology that a clinical psychologist can deal with. A clinical psychologist can deal with anything from a mild case of depression to a severe case of schizophrenia, an eating disorder, addiction, borderline personality disorder, a psychopath, bipolar, and more. The typical environment that a clinical psychologist works in is either a hospital, mental health institution, rehabilitation center, a prison, or a clinical psychologist can work in independent practice. The second category of psychology we're going to discuss is counseling psychology. Counselling psychology is a specialist category within professional psychology that promotes the personal, social, and educational functioning, career functioning, and well-being of individuals, couples, families, groups, organizations, and communities. Counseling psychologists assist people with normal development issues and also prevent and alleviate psychological and mental health disorders that range from mild to moderate severity. Psychological assessments, diagnosis, and formulation draw on a holistic appreciation of people's lived experiences and their social-cultural contexts. Counseling psychologists deliver a range of high-intensity psychological interventions that take into account the therapeutic potential of positive relationships and people's strengths and resources. According to the scope of practice, counseling psychologists can assess, diagnose, and intervene with clients who are dealing with life challenges and developmental problems to optimize psychological well-being. They can assess cognitive, personality, emotional, and neuropsychological functions in relation to life challenges and developmental problems. Counselling psychologists can assess developmental processes such as career choice and adjustment. They can identify psychopathology and its impact on developmental processes and adjustment. They can identify and diagnose disorders of adjustments. Counselling psychologists can apply psychological interventions to clients with developmental challenges and adjustment problems. And lastly, counselling psychologists can perform therapeutic counselling interventions. If you are not so interested in dealing with the very severe cases of psychopathology, but still want to help individuals that are suffering emotionally and struggling to cope with the various stages of life, then counseling psychology may be the better option for you. Counseling psychologists deal with mild cases of psychopathology and with coping with adjustments. So they deal with things like mild depression and anxiety, family and marital problems, being bullied at school, or career counseling, and many, many more. There are many environments in which a counseling psychologist can work, but here are some examples of typical work environments for counseling psychologists. They can work in hospitals, schools, colleges or universities, orphanages, or in private practice. The third category of psychology we are going to talk about is educational psychology. Educational psychology is a specialization of psychology concerned with assessment, diagnosis, formulation, and intervention in contexts that support the learning and development of individuals, with an emphasis on children and young people. Educational psychologists frequently consult with children and young people in settings such as the family, school, early childhood and development contexts, social, residential, and mental health settings, as well as parents, caregivers, and teachers. Educational psychology advocates a bioecological approach to psychological and educational intervention. According to the scope of practice, educational psychologists can assess, diagnose, and intervene with clients in order to optimize human functioning in learning and development. They can assess cognitive, personality, emotional, and neuropsychological functions of people in relation to the learning and development in which they have been trained. Educational psychologists can identify and diagnose psychopathology in relation to learning and development. They can also identify and diagnose barriers to learning and development. They apply psychological interventions to enhance, promote, and facilitate optimal learning and development. Educational psychologists perform therapeutic intervention in relation to learning and development. If you are interested in working with children and young adults, then perhaps this is the psychology that you should be considering. Educational psychologists help with learning and development. They can help children that are diagnosed with ADHD, ASD, or ODD. They can also help teenagers cope in a high school setting or find their career. There are a variety of environments in which an educational psychologist can work. Here are 3 examples: schools, colleges or universities, and in private practice. The fourth category of psychology we are going to talk about is industrial psychology. Industrial and organizational psychology is the science and practice of professionals who function in organizational and occupational settings with an aim to ethically explain, assess, and influence human behavior and its reciprocity at individual, group, and organizational levels, with all efforts directed at human flourishing and the sustainable development of all affected stakeholders. According to the scope of practice, industrial psychologists are involved in planning, developing, and applying paradigms, theories, models, constructs, and principles of psychology in the workplace in order to understand, modify, and enhance individual, group, and organizational behavior effectively. Industrial psychologists are also involved in performing psychometric and other assessments in order to determine the potential and/or suitability for training, development, and employment, and to determine individual, group, and organizational effectiveness, referring clients to appropriate professionals for assessment or intervention. Their work also involves designing, developing, standardizing, and implementing assessment tools and procedures related to the work environment. They are involved in facilitating individual and group processes for effective organizational functioning. Industrial psychologists are also involved in designing and developing strategies in consumer behavior, as well as developing interventions to ameliorate poor performance in work settings. They also design and implement programs based on understanding ergonomics. If you have a desire to go to work every day in corporate wear and have an interest in people as well as in business, then industrial psychology might be for you. Industrial psychology involves working with people in the workplace. An industrial psychologist performs tasks such as employee selection, employee development, managerial development, leadership development, team building, and occupational development. The fifth category of psychology that we're going to discuss is research psychology. So I unfortunately don't have an HPCSA definition of research psychology, so I'm just going to chat about it with you. If you are more an academic kind of person, and also if you're really interested in psychology and love psychology, you read a lot of psychology and you just want to understand human behavior, but you're not really that interested in working with people or giving therapy, then research psychology is a great idea for you. So, research psychology involves planning, developing, and applying psychological research methods. Research psychologists are involved in performing assessments relevant to the development of research for research purposes, including the development of psychological measures. They are also involved in researching, monitoring, and evaluating psychological interventions. Work environments in which research psychologists can work include universities and assessment development companies. The fifth category of psychology that we are going to discuss is neuropsychology, and this is the new category of psychology in South Africa. If you are interested in how the brain functions and psychology, then neuropsychology is for you. Neuropsychologists are involved in assessing the functioning of the brain, especially after something like a brain injury after a car accident. A neuropsychologist will determine whether the brain injury has made psychological changes to that individual, like perhaps changed their personality or affected their cognitive functioning. According to the scope of practice, neuropsychologists are involved in assessing, diagnosing, and intervening in the psychological disorders of people experiencing neuropathology or compromised function of the central nervous system. Neuropsychologists are involved in diagnosing and evaluating psychological disorders caused by neurological conditions and differentiating them from other psychological and non-neurological disorders. Lastly, neuropsychologists are involved in treating and rehabilitating the psychological disorders of people suffering from central nervous system dysfunction. Examples of a typical work environment for neuropsychologists include a hospital, a mental health institution, or a rehabilitation center. The final category of psychology we are going to discuss is forensic psychology. As far as I know, forensic psychology is not yet a registered category of psychology in South Africa. I think that psychologists can specialize in forensic psychology, but yes, there isn't a registered category. Forensic psychology can involve assessing criminals, for example, to see if they will repeat their offenses again, or assess an individual that has a court case coming up. This individual could be going through a divorce or have a medico legal case. Or a forensic psychologist could do work for the Road Accident Fund to assess whether a car accident or how a car accident or to what extent a car accident psychologically affected somebody's life. In short, forensic psychology involves psychology and the law. A forensic psychologist can work in a variety of environments, but here are some examples of where they could work. A forensic psychologist could work at a law firm, in a prison, for the South African Police Services, or in private practice. And that's it, guys. All the categories of psychology in South Africa. I hope that you found this video informative and that you enjoyed it. And if you did, please give me a thumbs up. I really appreciate all the love and support that you have given to me so far, and I hope that I am giving it to you too. Thank you very much. Have an awesome day, and please keep safe. Bye-bye.